We believe the best way, the only way really, to effectively defeat imperialism is for it to be organized by the working class who is oppressed by it. So the Venezuelan working class has to lead the fight against imperialism.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. In the past few months, the Trump administration has escalated its attacks on Venezuela. Since September, the US military has killed 100 people in at least 26 strikes on so-called, quote-unquote, drug boats. On top of that, the US is building up its military in the region, and Trump has ordered blockades of sanctioned oil tankers and the closure of airspace over Venezuela. Donald Trump has issued ultimatums to President Nicolás Maduro with the pretty explicit aim of regime change. And by the way, if you're feeling some deja vu right now, just a quick reminder, the US attempted to overthrow Maduro during Trump's first term as well. The name Juan Guaido maybe rings a bell. The Trump administration claims that what they're doing is all about fighting drug trafficking. That's why they're calling them drug boats. It's why they're making up really outrageous things like how each boat attack is saving hundreds of thousands of American lives from being lost to fentanyl. But here's the thing. All of this is actually about US imperialism. Venezuela has become the central target of Trump's attempts to exert political and economic control over Latin America. US hegemony is weakening, while China's influence is growing, in a region of the world that the US has traditionally considered its own backyard. Trump's moves are part of a new or sort of revitalized Monroe Doctrine of sorts. To discuss this on today's episode, I'm joined by Left Voice editor Samuel Karlin. Sam has been writing about Trump's attacks on Venezuela, as well as what the Trump administration means for US imperialism. I will link to his excellent pieces in the show notes. I will also link to an earlier episode of the podcast that I did with my comrade Jimena at the start of the year about Mexico and US imperialist policy there. In addition to explaining the imperialist aims of the US's moves in Venezuela and Latin America more broadly, particularly given US history in the region, Sam and I discuss what Republicans and Democrats' responses have been. Because, as we often say, support for US imperialism is bipartisan. Even though, as you may have seen in the news, Democrats have questioned to some extent the legality of Trump's boat attacks, Democrats are no friends of the Venezuelan people. For example, they supported that coup attempt that I mentioned earlier in Venezuela during Trump's first term. Democrats also support sanctions, which bring nothing but misery and suffering to the Venezuelan masses. Most importantly, Sam and I discussed the tasks for the international working class. The path forward is not to support regimes like the one of Nicolás Maduro, who is the head of a repressive, bankrupt, and anti-democratic capitalist government that has actually facilitated the imperialist exploitation of Venezuela. Instead, liberation for Latin America, for Venezuela, and the defeat of US imperialism in the region can only come from international unity between workers, students, socialists, and the social movements in Latin American countries, as well as here in the United States. As we always say, our struggles are connected. So this is not just a moral necessity. It's not just about, solidarity with our international class siblings. It is a strategic necessity. Workers make the economy and imperialism run, which means that we can also, united, grind imperialism to a halt. Here's my conversation with Sam. Sam, welcome back to the podcast. I want to kind of get to the heart of the matter right away, which is about what the motivation is behind President Trump's escalating attacks in Venezuela. Because, on the one hand, the administration itself claims that these are so-called drug boats, in heavy air quotes here, that it's blowing up. It claims that this is all against, drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. Other people will say that this is all about getting access to Venezuela's oil. Venezuela also is rich in a lot of other resources. And then you have some people, I feel like these are maybe more the sort of like hashtag resistance liberals who kind of say that like Venezuela is all just a distraction from Trump's terrible job performance. It's a distraction from maybe even like the Epstein scandal. So why is Trump doing this?
So let's just start with this is not at all about drug trafficking. That is total bullshit, just as the vast majority of reasons that the US declares for going to war are usually bullshit. We've seen it with WMDs in Iraq. We've seen it with the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. The US lies to justify imperialist ventures. I don't think we need to take it that seriously. The vast majority of drugs are trafficked not from Latin America, not through Venezuela, but Colombia, which there is some conflict there between the U.S. and Gustavo Petro. But for the most part, Colombia is still very much an ally or asset of the U.S. And Trump has even recently pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted for drug trafficking. And he, under his presidency, which was imposed through a coup backed by the U.S. under the Obama administration, this former president of Honduras, he turned the country into a narco state. So there's just many, many details we can point to show that the idea that this is about drug trafficking is a total lie. Then there's sectors who are critical of these interventions, who say that this is all about oil. I've heard this even anecdotally from people who are not necessarily that political, but who oppose what's going on. And I think the common conception is that it's about oil. And that's not entirely inaccurate. That is a part of it. Venezuela has the largest known oil reserves in the entire Western Hemisphere, and Trump is really leaning into fossil fuels as a way to reinvigorate the economy. He says no green transition, no green technologies. He wants Venezuela's oil reserves. It's not inaccurate for people to point that out. That said, what I really, really think people need to understand is that Trump has a mostly coherent foreign policy, at least as coherent as attempts at big new foreign policies are. He's not a madman. He has been very consistent, even since he returned to the presidency, about focusing U.S. Attention, military resources, diplomatic resources, energy on controlling the Western Hemisphere, specifically the Caribbean and Latin America. Right? This is a big part of how he's conceiving of global strategy. We may have even talked about this on a previous podcast. I've written a lot about it. Trump sees the U.S. as strained around the world, committed to too many alliances, international institutions, and there's truth to this. The U.S. has been stretched thin in being a global hegemon, and it also has lost a lot of the industrial capacity necessary to be a global hegemon and to compete with rivals, particularly China, which economically, militarily, politically is rising in a way that is a real challenge to the U.S. Trump is concerned about this. There's a few prongs to his strategy. One is he wants to pull back U.S. resources from regions that he sees as not in the U.S.'s immediate interest, and lean on allies to basically militarily carry security of the region. This is a big thing that informs his Middle East policy. It's a big thing that informs his Europe policy. And the flip side of that, of trying to pull resources away from certain regions and attention away from certain regions, is to focus a lot on Latin America, which has been really the keystone of U.S. imperialism. The United States became an empire through the Spanish-American War, which was concentrated in the Caribbean, which led to the annexation of, seizure and U.S. basically taking as colonies Puerto Rico, for a time Cuba, until the Revolution. In that regard, the Caribbean is very important to the foundation of U.S. empire. I'll try to give a brief history, I swear. The U.S. has historically referred to Latin America as its backyard and established a Monroe Doctrine, which is a historical aspect of U.S. imperialism, which essentially declared no foreign powers, read at the time European imperialist powers, can control Latin America, can challenge U.S. power. The United States controls the Americas. That's essentially what it was, and it has historically imposed this through backing brutal coups and dictatorships, military interventions, economic interventions, lawfare. We've seen many different forms even in the 21st century. The coup in Honduras backed by the Obama administration that I mentioned. The intervention which at the time in Brazil led to the ouster of Dilma Rousseff and also allowed Bolsonaro to take power. Recent interventions in terms of the United States intervening, basically saying that if Argentina doesn't elect his ally, Javier Milei, he would withhold aid. And he attempted this again in Honduras. Basically, from the foundation of the United States being an empire to now, there was a brief blip while the U.S. was focused on the Middle East, but Trump is really trying to bring back this historical focus of U.S. imperialism on essentially Latin America being its realm of strategic interest. This is a strategic region. It is a region with large workforces, and we see the power that has, for example, in Mexico, where U.S. multinationals have been able to rely on maquiladoras, which are these factories with just severe exploitation of the Mexican working class. It's rich in mineral and material resources, the oil in Venezuela, but also it's the lithium triangle, which is in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, is the site of the largest lithium reserves. There's all sorts of other important minerals there. So just in terms of economically, in terms of its potential workforce, in terms of its regional advantages, it is super important to U.S. strategy and just the U.S. being able to concentrate on rebuilding itself as a power that is unchecked militarily, economically, politically, and Trump wants to intervene aggressively to cement that.
That's super helpful, and I really appreciate you bringing up both the current and historical context behind what's happening. But something I'm wondering, though, based on this analysis, is why Venezuela in particular, right? Like, should we also expect the Trump administration to go after other countries in the region soon using similar strong-arming tactics? Or is it fair to say that Venezuela in particular makes sense right now, perhaps because it has put up more resistance compared to other countries in Latin America?
Absolutely. Yes. I think it is fair to say that Venezuela it makes sense that he would focus on Venezuela for a few reasons. One, Venezuela has resisted falling under U.S. influence. Now, some sectors of the left overstate that. Left Voice in our international organization, we don't characterize, what happened with the rise of Hugo Chavez, the former president, taking power. We don't consider that a revolution. Capital was not expropriated. U.S. multinationals were still allowed to function to some extent. Even now, Maduro has actually been allowing Chevron access to oil in Venezuela. So it's not like this is a country that just totally had a revolution, the workers seized power and now capitalism can't operate there. But there is a way in which Venezuela has been resistant to many of the U.S. demands. It's led to a point of tension. It's led to a breaking apart of relations and the United States having less access, especially compared to economic powers it sees as sort of being in somewhat of an emerging rival economic bloc led by Russia, led by China. You also have Iran as well. So there's this aspect of there is a real way in which Venezuela falls outside of the influence of the US order, especially compared to a lot of other countries in Latin America. So that's one reason why Trump is focusing. I also think because of this historic tension, Venezuela is easier, and that's relative, but I would say easier to pursue regime change. In fact, it was under Donald Trump's first presidency that he attempted a coup in Venezuela, backing this figure, Juan Guaido, who no one took seriously except for both parties in the US. This attempt at a coup that no one in Venezuela supported was backed by Trump and Nancy Pelosi. So across the board, there was support. There's less support now for the very provocative, escalatory actions Trump is taking. But it's not like the Democrats or, more anti-imperialist, I say that in big quotes, Republicans, it's not like they are against U.S. imperialism in Latin America. It's not like they are against Maduro being ousted. And we see this reflected in even like mainstream press from the Wall Street Journal, which sort of represents Republicans, New York Times, which represents a lot of Democrats. And our comrade James has written a great article on this. There is a lot of support for essentially regime change in Venezuela. There's support from the sectors of U.S. imperialism and the voices and figures. I believe it's Maria Machado, the new
Maria Corina Machado,
the leader in waiting, living in Europe, Nobel Prize winner. There's a lot of support for her. She got the Nobel Prize, right? Again, when I say there's a lot of support, I mean from imperialist figures. That said, I think in Trump betting that Venezuela is an easy target for this reason, I think he's overplaying his hand because, as we're seeing, there is at least some skepticism about the methods that he is going to in terms of this confrontation and attempt at regime change in Venezuela.
Yeah, boy oh boy, have the mainstream media never found a regime change operation that they did not want to support and cheerlead on its front pages. Looking at you, New York Times.
I'm going to be concerned when a coup is happening and they're all silent. Like,
Yeah, seriously.
I,
Yeah.
should I
Well,
support this coup? No.
yeah, right? Yeah. Well, on the topic of support, I think that kind of segues me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is where the other parts of the US government or regime are on this issue. Because when it comes to this escalation, obviously Donald Trump and Secretary of War, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have been in the news a lot, especially around the controversies of the videos of the bombings and stuff like that. But I'm especially curious about where the rest of the Republicans are on this issue, since the big news of the past like month or 2 months has been that there are a lot of divisions in the MAGA movement on a lot of issues. Like there was, for example, the sort of defection of Marjorie Taylor Greene. There are these sectors of Republicans that are very sort of like nationalist and anti-interventionist. Like I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson, for example. So is the Republican Party united behind Trump's actions, or are there divisions in the Republican Party, in the MAGA movement, on the point of intervention in Venezuela?
Well, we have a really convenient recent pulse of where the Republicans are on this, and to some extent the Democrats too. As we're recording this, the previous night there was a vote in the House of Representatives, essentially for Congress to say, actually, it's our decision if we're going to declare war, and we're going to prevent Trump from just declaring war on Venezuela, right? Like a War Powers Act. We got to see how the voting played out, and it was largely along partisan lines. Most Democrats voted for the resolutions, which would essentially prevent Trump from declaring war on Venezuela. I believe it was three Republicans joined them, right? And they were Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is an interesting figure, and we quite frankly just need we can't get into her. That warrants its own podcast episode. I will say I don't buy her anti-imperialist rebranding for a second.
She's a land of
But
contrasts, but you
yeah,
do not
yeah,
gotta hand it to her. We
I,
can
I
leave it
think
at
she's
that.
politically savvy is what I can give her.
Yeah.
That's something I can give her. That's about the only thing. But she voted basically for the resolution, which would prevent Trump from declaring war. But the point is that overall, there's not been much opposition whatsoever from Republicans on this. The Democrats, I think, are a different story.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about how the Democrats respond because you mentioned the resolution that would prevent Trump from declaring war, and the Democrats overwhelmingly voted for that. And this is one of these questions where I want to, tell the audience that I'm not asking this question sincerely. Um, are the Democrats anti-war, and are they being anti-imperialist?
I think, what is it, 3 years now of genocide in Palestine shows us very clearly whether or not the Democratic Party is anti war or anti imperialist. But we are talking about something new, which is Venezuela, and they are being much quicker to condemn this. Now, I think there's a few reasons for that. I think it's because the president is a Republican and a lot of people hate him. So I think they're reading the political winds of there's a lot of hatred towards Trump, and they kind of need to look like they're opposing him. I think from the Democratic Party, there is a genuine opposition to what Trump is doing. But again, it's not opposition to U.S. imperialist control of Latin America. It's opposition to the way in which Trump is essentially pursuing an aggressive imperialism, what we call gunboat diplomacy, the Monroe Doctrine. There's, I think, a few layers to this. One is people are horrified by this idea of the double tap. Specifically, Trump has struck a bunch of boats in Venezuela. There wasn't a lot of outrage. I think there was people being like, hey, I'm not about this. What is he doing? But it wasn't until there was news of a case in which two people actually survived and reportedly were clinging to the boat in the ocean. And the US military carried out a second strike to kill them. And that is just such an egregious act that I think that really galvanized a lot more of the Democratic Party base and maybe, well-meaning but not consistently anti-war liberals were horrified by that. And I think that created more of a push for the Democrats to be opposed to what Trump is doing. I think there's other layers too. I think there's the aspect of Trump has located 20% of all US naval assets to the Caribbean. And that costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to shift where an aircraft carrier is going to be, to run an aircraft carrier, to pay all the sailors and Marines who are now on deployments regarding this. It costs a lot of money to wage grand scale military operations. And so I think there's a lot of questions about that. And then I also think that there's questions of the volatility that this could cause, right? If Trump actually does carry out, strikes on Venezuela, regime change, there's going to be a lot of migration because we already saw lots of Venezuelans, like Venezuelans were one of the main groups coming to the US, and that's not entirely because of US imperialism, right? We'll get into this, but Maduro has also caused a lot of the crisis and misery there. But US sanctions have also just been a nightmare, right? Sanctions destroy an economy, destroy access to basic things like food, to medicine. And regime change is even more destabilizing. And so I think there's also concern about the regional volatility, which would affect the whole region, but would also then come back to the U.S. as well. I don't think the Democrats care about the Venezuelan people. I think they've shown that plenty of times. I think they want US imperialism to be dominant in Latin America, but I think for a variety of reasons, the way that Trump is carrying this out, they really just have no choice but to act as somewhat of an opposition to what he is doing.
Yeah, we should say also that, I mean, Democrats also historically have supported things like sanctions, which, as you just mentioned, and as we've written about before, are really horrific and are really, murderous for the working class and oppressed in places
If
like
I can
Venezuela.
Tony Blinken, who I hate as much as I hate Pete Hegseth, they are both on a in a level layer if you believe in hell, they're in the layer of hell that Henry Kissinger is burning in. Right? They have spots designated for those two, I believe, with the caveat that I don't believe in hell. But point is that Tony Blinken loved sanctions. He was a massive, massive supporter of that as a way to carry out U.S. foreign policy. And the record that his support for sanctions has in Iran, in Venezuela, right, in terms of depriving the people of those countries of medicine, of food, is just horrific.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier about our stance on Venezuela, because at this point in the conversation, a lot of people might conclude that basically the solution here is that we need to stand steadfastly with the Maduro regime. This is what you hear, for example, from people that we would call campist, this idea that there are sort of different camps in the world. And if you're not in the US's camp, you are in the camp of in this case, for example, the Venezuelan regime or the Maduro government. Why don't we support Nicolás Maduro? Given everything you've said so far, why shouldn't we defend his government against these imperialist maneuvers?
Yes, there's a lot of reasons, and all of them I will preface with the very, very clear position. We are firmly on the side of Venezuela, of the Venezuelan people, when it comes to a military confrontation between the United States and Venezuela. We are on the side of Venezuela. The US imperialism has to be defeated in the region. We believe the best way, the only way really, to effectively defeat imperialism is for it to be organized by the working class who is oppressed by it. So the Venezuelan working class has to lead the fight against imperialism. Why is this? Imperialism isn't just a policy choice. I think as many people sort of look at it as the US votes to go to war, and wouldn't it be nice if we elected a bunch of people who would vote for it to not go to war? And I'm looking at you, Jacobin, and these sort of maybe bourgeois pacifist sectors who look at it as a question of policy. But then even as you mentioned, right, there's the campus left who they in many ways also understand it as a policy, as this idea that the US does aggressive things to other countries. Imperialism, as Lenin put it, it's a system. It encompasses all the economic relations spanning the globe, the whole system in which capitalism is connected, in which workers are an international class, in which exploitation happens everywhere. It's a system in which the US is at the top. And because it is a system, you can't effectively end imperialism, oppose imperialism without calling into question and fighting for the end of that whole system. Maduro does not do that. This gets back to what we were saying. Despite what some people say, Chavismo was not a revolution which expropriated capitalists in Venezuela. Capitalists have been able to exist in Venezuela. And increasingly, right, the pink tide, which Chavismo was a part of, came at a time when there was a commodities boom, and it was easier for these center-left leaders to basically maintain capitalism while also giving greater concessions to workers, right, doing all sorts of progressive reforms and legislation and programs. And that's just become impossible as the economic situation has changed in Latin America. And In the case of Venezuela, this contradiction, the way that we've seen it develop, is that in order for Maduro to deal with the fact that actually Venezuela never expropriated capitalists, and it was never a state in which the working class seized power and established a planned economy, he has relied on essentially a bureaucratic clique, largely through the power of the military, right? The military has a huge influence over the state. That's actually right where Chavez came from, was right from the military. And so by leaning on the relationship that the military in Venezuela has with the regime, it basically enforces strict repression to keep workers' organizations and just in general sectors, that popular sectors, young people, workers who question, hey, actually, why are we suffering when there is still capitalism, when Chevron is still operating in the country, when Maduro is living well? The way that this class contradiction is kept in check is by Maduro leaning on a repressive military regime that prevents workers from organizing independently, that prevents them from protesting. And right now, what we're seeing is that because Trump is genuinely attacking Venezuela, Maduro seems to be able to rally a lot of support. He was hated. You see this reflected in the fact that people mostly didn't participate in elections. And even throughout Latin America, he became very isolated, even from other left-wing governments like Lula in the recent election, where it was just very obviously fraudulent. It was embarrassingly rigged. So Maduro was hated. It looks like there's a way in which, because as hated as he is, Venezuelans don't want regime change. They don't want the U.S. attacking them. It seems like things on the ground, and I don't have the best pulse of this, although we do have comrades in Venezuela who cover more directly on the ground. But it looks like there's a situation in which Maduro has been able to sort of rally some national support and sort of legitimize his regime a little bit more in this context. And you have sectors of the left, I'll just say it, the PSL being a big one here in the US, that essentially put forward, we need to support this. Look at how many people are joining the Venezuelan military right now. Isn't that great? It shows resistance to imperialism. But the problem is that this is a regime that has actually allowed Chevron to operate, that has been saying, hey, actually, we're willing to discuss with the US, what concessions can we give you to get us off our back? And that is not the terms in which we can confront imperialism. Now, if the workers of Venezuela, if the popular sectors, the ones who have most to lose from regime change, from a destabilization and attack on their country, if they could actually organize independently, call assemblies where they come together and they're like, how are we going to make sure that the US doesn't militarily attack us, but I don't know, also doesn't use its economic power to attack us, doesn't allow Chevron to operate? What if we actually expropriated the capitalists and planned the economy and mobilized in massive numbers and called for solidarity from workers in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Mexico, in the United States? What if we organized unions across the region, across the whole hemisphere to say, hey, no, we're going to go on strike together until Trump stops doing these attacks? I'm sure that any number of even more creative and concrete ideas would come about if the Venezuelan working class and popular sectors were able to organize resistance to imperialism independently of what the Maduro regime is putting forward as its ostensible resistance to imperialism. So that is why at Left Voice and as our international organization, the Trotskyist Fraction, Fourth International, we do not put forward a politics of supporting Maduro. We see him as an enemy and a repressor of the working class. And that is important because the working class of Venezuela, of Latin America, of the United States, and of the world is the only force that's actually in a material position to be consistent in overthrowing the whole system of imperialism.
Yeah, this leads me, I think, really nicely into the last thing I wanted to ask, which I guess is kind of a two-part question a little bit, which is that it's really clear from this conversation and also from, I'm assuming, what the listeners already know, which is that politicians are not going to stop Trump. They're not going to stop escalations against Venezuela, let alone, obviously they're not going to stop US imperialism. So my two questions are kind of leading on to the last things you were mentioning is what are the tasks for leftists and the working class? And why does Venezuela matter so much? Like, why should the working class, why should leftists really take this issue up with full force?
I think to start, we have seen people in the US are sick of endless wars. That does not mean that people in the US are anti imperialist. There's an important sector, as we've seen with Palestine. They mostly are just like, hey, what are we doing here? Could we spend our money elsewhere? And that's important. It should develop. But right now, that's an important factor that people are sick of that. And so I think those people who maybe haven't made the jump to full anti-imperialist yet or consistent anti-war perspective, but who are skeptical of just these constant interventions, need to understand that if Trump can get away with his attacks on Venezuela, he will continue them. He has already threatened that Colombia is next. He's threatened Mexico. I think if he can basically see his interventions and his aggression in Venezuela as a successful way of advancing US power there, he is going to carry out more attacks in Latin America and in South America. And that means more military interventions, more money going to military interventions. Part two is that more military interventions means instability. We saw this with the first war on drugs. It was horrible. It was horrible for the region. It totally destabilized and just set rampant violent forces which attacked workers in Nicaragua, in Colombia, in Mexico. And I'm trying to think of how to not play to nativist sentiments. So first of all, we just should say, frankly, it's horrific for the people of Latin America to be constantly suffering this instability and violence that the US imposes and that it did with the original war on drugs. And we don't want to see that happen again. Any person who just cares about basic humanity should not want to see that happen again in Latin America. It is important to note that the US will not be immune from this. And I reject the idea that we should only care if it impacts the US. The idea that, if any of this would be fine, just as long as it doesn't hurt US workers is not what I'm putting forward. But for people in the US who are wondering, well, I oppose this and yeah, it sucks, but what does it mean for me? Well, let's talk about what it means. First of all, as we said, it means a lot more money going into even more military interventions. It means instability in Latin America leads to migration, and we are pro-migration. We call for open borders. We support the right to migrate. But we have also seen how, there's this cycle of the U.S. intervenes. It displaces a lot of people. They migrate to the U.S. The capitalists don't make, it's not a system that actually can accommodate or, adapt to mass migration or benefit from it. The right says, hey, look, this is causing a strain. They whip reactionary forces up against immigrants. So part two is that the stability that this would cause is fodder which could strengthen the far right here in the US, put them in a position to wage even more attacks on LGBTQ plus people, right? On immigrants, on Black people, on whatever oppressed communities that are attacked more when the right is strengthened. Instability in Latin America will allow for the right to essentially position themselves as stronger within the US. Another thing, sort of on that note, is that Trump's militarization, based on this idea of narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, is the militarization in Latin America is deeply, intimately connected to the militarization that we're seeing here in the United States. The United States military now controls more than 1/3 of all land along the US southern border because Trump has been saying, well, the military needs jurisdiction of this land to keep invasion out, to keep narco terrorists out. The justification for militarizing Chicago, LA, Portland, DC, everywhere he wants to militarize in the US, he is justifying it based on, in part, this war on narco-terrorism. And there's echoes of how the drug war in the 80s also led to a boom in mass incarceration of Black people. So those themes are still there of how it also leads to repressive apparatuses, the plural of that, building up in the US. So I think, with that, I really, really urge people in the US who are upset about this, who oppose this, but who haven't necessarily thought about it in terms of their own need to mobilize or their own need to organize. It needs to be taken up strongly. Immigrant rights activists who have been doing a beautiful job resisting militarism within the US, they need to be mobilizing against militarism in the Caribbean and Latin America. Immigrant rights NGOs and autonomous groups and community organizations that have shown they can organize really strongly when the military comes to their city, they need to put that same amount of energy into building links, into building opposition across the country against what Trump is doing in Latin America, against his aggression. The movement for Palestine, which has inspired a whole generation of young people and has forced some unions to, from the rank and file, take up anti-imperialist positions. That movement for Palestine, it cannot just focus on imperialism in the Middle East, as important as that is to keep focusing on. It also needs to mobilize and build a movement against U.S. imperialism in Latin America, against the war on Venezuela. From Venezuela to Palestine, U.S. imperialism has to be opposed. We have to mobilize against it. And importantly, we are Marxists. We are socialists. We believe that the working class is the strategic force because it has no obligations to Chevron. It has no obligations to any of the businesses that are, carrying out the genocide or profiting off the genocide in Gaza. The working class does not have those economic interests, and it is the force that actually controls the economy, that actually keeps everything running. So unions need to take strong positions against imperialism. They need to use their labor power. We saw beautiful, powerful example of this in Italy. We saw a strike where, 60% of the entire country didn't show up to work. That forced Italy to denounce that Israel had taken prisoner the activists on the global Samud flotilla. It showed the power that happens when workers use the power of their labor to say no and grind imperialist countries to a halt. We need to see more of that applied in the United States. We need rank and file unionists to fight for this because union bureaucrats will not take positions on imperialism if they are not made to. So we need to see unions take that example from Italy, take the knowledge of the power that they have to grind everything to a halt, and think about how they can use that power to say, no, we're sick of U.S. interventions. We're sick of U.S. imperialism. We see workers in Venezuela, workers in Mexico, workers throughout Latin America as our friends, as strategic allies who have their own power in their countries to use their labor power to link with our struggles. And so we are going to fight against this intervention with our labor power here in the U.S. against these attacks on Venezuela. No new Monroe Doctrine.
I think that's a really powerful place to end it. Sam, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. As you can tell, I've just been itching to go on my soapbox about this.